Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Anderson. I'm co-director with Professor Emerita Robin Ewing of the Create Centre, which is hosting this event this evening. Thanks so much for joining us on this Thursday evening. Before we kick off, I want to acknowledge that we're doing this podcast, or at least I am, on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also wanted to just give a quick plug for Create. So Create's the organisation, as I said, that's hosting tonight. And Create is dedicated to the application of creativity in the arts, in health, education, and really all sectors of society. So if you're interested in kind of events such as these and research in this area, please feel free to kind of click on our website. And I think Anna, who I have to thank for organising this evening as well, will drop or has dropped the link to join Create into the chat. It's completely free and you can find out about all the events and know what's going on. So please feel free to join and you'll be kept up to date. So as I said, Create is really focused on how we apply the arts in different contexts. And that brings me to Meera's work. And I'm so excited that Meera can join us this evening. Meera Atkinson is a writer publishing creative non-fiction, fiction and poetry, and an interdisciplinary scholar, primarily working at the nexus of literary studies, trauma theory and affect theory. Her writings appeared in publications such as Salon.com, Best Australian Poems, Best Australian Stories, Meanjin, Southerly, The Griffith Review. Her books include Traumata, The Poetics of Transgenerational Trauma, and the co-edited volume Traumatic Effect. She teaches creative writing in the English discipline at the University of Sydney. So obviously Meera's work is a fantastic showcase of how the arts kind of are reaching into places that they always have in some ways, but in Meera's work, I think we see something really specific and really fascinating about how writing and poetry, specifically works in trauma and how we understand trauma. So I'd really like to welcome Meera tonight and look forward to hearing what you have to say, Meera. And at the end, we'll do some questions, but feel free to post those questions at any time in the chat. Over to you, Meera.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And hi, everybody, and hello to those who will catch up later. Apparently, a lot of people who are registered might not make it on the day, but might catch it on YouTube. So thanks, everybody, for coming. Before I start working through some slides, I want to just say that this presentation showcases an interdisciplinary collaboration that confirms creative interpretation of social research can enhance the impact of traditional findings. And I'm really hoping to see more of these kinds of collaborations in general, but specifically in FAS and beyond at USyd. And that's the reason that I approached Create about doing this webinar. Okay, so I'm just going to clumsily, this process is always a bit clumsy, I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to get my slideshow going. So I want to begin by saying that as we're talking about incarceration and discrimination, I want to take this moment to acknowledge not only the country I'm presenting on and the unceded and ongoing sovereignty of the Gadigal people, but also that according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are incarcerated at almost 10 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. And that is by and large for very, very petty crimes. And a mighty Aboriginal activist community is rallying around this injustice that I encourage everybody to engage with. Okay, so let me begin. Overview of where we're going to go today. Background on the study and the team who conducted it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of creative writer recruitment, my process of writing, and the sort of broader process of consultation around that, the community involvement in the performance for dissemination. This will all make more sense soon. The traditional and non-traditional dissemination rollout, and finally the evaluation of the impact of both of those. So it all began at the UNSW Centre for Social Research in Health. The project title is Identifying Factors that Improve the Health of People Newly Released from Prison Who Inject Drugs. So it's funded. I'll just give you a second here to read these aims rather than read them out at you. And I'll give you another second. The first paragraph's the most important, but just have a look at that. So people with histories of injecting drug use constitute up to 58% of the prison population and report extremely high reincarceration rates. That's the big takeaway here. In short, a really, really important study in an area that really needs attention. So the research team, just a little bit more background on that, was led by Carla Trelaw, the Centre Director and Sentia Professor, and research fellow Karen Drysdale was the writer point of contact. So Karen was the person that I had most contact with and that the other writers had most contact with. And I'm going to start by playing an excerpt from a seminar that was held, a webinar that was held at the Centre, UNSW, last year. I participated in that. The person who performed my piece, Bindi Andrews, participated. So I'm going to play you two excerpts from that, because that way you see the team directly talking to the really pertinent aspects of their side of this collaboration. Before I do that, though, I just want to make these acknowledgements on behalf of the team. There was a very elaborate and important ethics process at various levels of this project, and it was funded. This is the background, and I'm just going to start by playing it. Karen, this is Karen basically offering a bit of a background and overview of the project that is a really important part of the picture.
You know, over 50% of people incarcerated in Australia report pre-incarceration history of injecting drug use. And among prison entrants with a history of injecting drug use, 8 out of 10 reported prior incarceration. So we can see that there's a very cyclical, embedded kind of relationship between drugs and justice involvement. Crimes committed by people who use drugs related to drug offences typically attract shorter sentences, and so the rate of reincarceration is high. Recent Australian data underscores that link between injecting drug use, involvement with the criminal justice system, and an extraordinarily high rate of recidivism. So there's a typical pattern of numerous episodes of incarceration, shorter sentences among people who inject drugs, highlights the crucial need to exploit these opportunities to interrupt this cycle. Now, around 40,000 people are released every year from prison, at least 16,000 of which are estimated to return to prison at least once in subsequent years. So when combined with prisoners on remand and then released, the number of justice-involved people in Australia far exceeds those currently in prison. And that's an estimated 385,000 people, 1.8% of the Australian population have been incarcerated. Next slide, please. So very briefly, participants were recruited for this particular qualitative study, which is an interview-based project from a longitudinal cohort study called Supermix, based in Melbourne and the surrounding suburbs. We recruited 48 individuals that had been involved in Supermix, and they were invited to participate in the qualitative interview. And you can see here that the eligibility requirements was that they served a prison term of greater than 3 months. This means that if they were holding rented or social housing, that might have been disrupted and contributing to issues experiencing homelessness, but also that they were released in the previous 12 months, so that those newly released experiences are foremost in their minds. And all of the participants had a history of injecting drug use. Now, what we were trying to do here was a convenience sample by looking at different modes of substance use, different housing experiences, including whether they were vulnerable, stable, or transiently housed. And so the attempt here was to get a fairly comprehensive sample of participants. Next slide, thanks, Tim. I'm going to quickly outline the process because, look, I'm sure that you actually want to hear from the writer and the performer of these narrative pieces more than me. But I just want to reiterate, this was quite an involved process. And I think Meera has referred to it as writing by committee. So you can see the first step was that we developed a concept sheet and workshopped this with the research team. We then recruited a community advisory group through existing networks to oversee the entire project. We workshopped the themes with the advisory group, and then we went back to the transcripts to find relevant excerpts from each of the transcripts that match those themes. Next slide, please, Tim. Then we engaged artists who were sensitive to these themes, and they were commissioned to produce written artistic interpretations by drawing on those excerpts from blended anonymised transcripts. And this was a really iterative process that did involve a lot of feedback from both the research team and the community advisory group. The outcome was 3 written pieces that conveyed these themes by drawing on the experiences of research participants. And as we've seen in Meera's case, that these artistic narratives were publishable in their own right as a product of artistic endeavour. So in this case, the piece that we're going to play to you today went on to be published in a literary journal. Next slide, thanks, Tim. The process wasn't ended at that point. We then put out a call out for community members with lived experience to participate in the process of bringing these written pieces to life. So 4 people were then invited to participate in rehearsals with the award-winning theatre director, Lisa Marie Siren, before performing these pieces in our new UNSW recording studio. Next slide, thanks. Finally, we engaged Carolyn Craig, who you may recognise from the Underbelly series, to host the 3-part series. And she provided the intro and I guess the sort of explainer that went after each of those performed pieces. And this was done by drawing on relevant literature to make sure that we can reiterate how grounded these themes and these narrative pieces were in the actual literature in this area. Next slide, thanks, Tim. So what we have is evocative and compelling narratives that illustrate difficulties faced and the strategies that people use to aid successful reintegration into community. It was really important for us that in conveying some of the difficulties that people face in the post-release period, that we also provided hope. And so a lot of the narratives also provided strategies that our research participants told us that they used to overcome some of these challenges. And so we're hoping that these narratives could be used as an effective resource for services and incarcerated people alike to help mitigate some of these challenges in this post-release context. But as Tim will go on to explain, there's also an added benefit in producing these in our attempt to change public opinion on people who use drugs and formerly incarcerated people. So next slide, thanks, Tim. This is just a snapshot of the involvement that we had among numerous stakeholders to produce these pieces. So absolute credit to everyone who was involved in this, because it was an incredibly inspiring experience, really working with our community advisory group and our writers and performers to ensure that what we had was a really compelling and evidence-based narrative.
Okay, so that was really important context, I think, especially for people who, you know, in social research who are interested in exploring this potential. And it shows how this project really attempted to address the lack of research into the vital post-release period. I will just say a quick correction. Karen mentioned that my piece got published. It did, but it was not actually a literary publication. It was a publication called Right Now, which is an online magazine focused on human rights. It publishes opinion, interviews, reviews, as well as creative works. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And I also just want to acknowledge I've elected to have subtitles up. They're a bit clunky and very unreliable, but it's an attempt to be inclusive. Okay, so the study findings. The study concluded that 3 factors negatively affected transition on release, above all other factors as well, of course, but punitive responses to missed appointments, post-release exhaustion, distrust of institutions, and as the study proves, often with good reason, impeding access to support and relevant services. These are the traditional publications that were produced, and we'll talk a bit more about the comparative between the impact of the traditional and the creative down the track. So, writer recruitment and themes. The researchers sought 3 writers to interpret each of those 3 key findings creatively via engagement with the interview transcripts. So, study participants had agreed to this process up front. They knew that this novel research dissemination was planned. I was approached and recruited first by Dr. Drysdale. Karen and I had met as participants in the ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellowship Research Leadership Mentoring Scheme at the University of Melbourne, led by Professor Joy Demalcy a few years back. And so, you know, we kind of connected directly before Red Room Poetry were recruited to appointed to recruit the other 2 writers and to liaise with the writers. And as I say, Karen remained very involved with that process and with the writers as well. So I opted to write on the exhaustion theme. Carissa Lee, a Noongar actor and writer, wrote on the trust theme. And Guillermo Baptiste wrote on the structural competency theme. So we were briefed that this would involve a thorough ethical and community consultation process spanning several stages and many months. In fact, it has taken many months and stages for the whole process to be completed. So in this presentation, what's left of it, I focus on my piece and process for 2 reasons. Obviously, I can only speak about my process of crafting a creative work based on study findings. And 2, my perform piece was selected to feature in the dissemination campaign and for audience evaluation. So the writing process, the researchers split the interview transcripts into sort of 3 chunks to align with each theme as closely as possible, but there was some unavoidable overlap. So each writer sometimes got some similar material and some material that was not overlapping. The interview material was obviously in various voices because it was compiled from a number of interviews. And, you know, those voices implied different genders, racial identification, sensibilities, experiences, and outcomes. So I made 2 crucial initial decisions creatively. One was, upon review of this material, to create a composite character. And 2 was to weave a poetic narrative out of the resonant points and experiences around my theme of exhaustion. So I drew directly from the transcripts, which is what we were advised to do. And the character that came into view for me was a woman with a childhood history of trauma who had lost custody of her child and was affected by intimate partner violence before and post-release. So I reviewed the transcripts, highlighting the statements that helped me craft the characterization and the experiences that highlighted the theme of exhaustion. So in my original print version, I crafted a monologue hybrid prose/verse kind of poems narrative, which, you know, sometimes it's kind of formatted in short prose like paragraphs. Other times it kind of flips into a bit of verse lineage and lineation, sorry. And I employed strategies like enjambment, which is the continuation of a phrase or sentence from one line to the next, spacing, rhythm, repetition. Writers had permission to change the quotes from the transcript, so we could remove or add and otherwise sort of reshape the words from the transcript material as needed. I tried to stay as true to the spirit of what was being communicated when I did this, but I did have to do this for the piece to work as a creative piece. So the kind of craft foci for me was, as I said, characterization, voice, and creating a narrative arc that showed the progression of this composite character's experience and story post-release. I also wanted to pay real attention to rhythm and affect. So, you know, that sort of aspect of feeling emotion and stimulating empathy to try and really get the reader/audience to have a real felt sense of these experiences. So each piece was then reviewed by a community advisory committee, which was facilitated by the researchers, and adjustments were negotiated. So it was a very tricky process because community members, you know, would sort of review the creative pieces, and they would offer really valuable insights and suggestions for rewording or edits or, you know, changes to the text that aim to ensure accurate representation, because that was their concern, that their experiences be well represented, and but they didn't necessarily have the artistic expertise to know how that was going to affect the piece creatively. So, you know, my job was to sometimes push back a bit and incorporate that to the degree that I could, but also to sort of protect the integrity of the piece creatively, because, you know, primarily I was tasked with producing a compelling, effective and affective piece of creative writing. So, you know, there's a sort of aspect in which that creative aspect of the work really had to be safeguarded in that consultation process. So I'll just show you briefly the print publication, just so you can see how there's a reason why I'm showing you this. You can see how I laid it out. I crafted my piece as I heard it in reading terms, and it was in the end quite different to how it was performed. I was going to read, if I could get that up, I was going to read just the opening section, so that you could get a sense of my rhythm and my reading, as opposed to the performed piece, which hopefully we will be able to listen to in a minute. I don't think one was better or worse. I mean, there are certain things about my formatting and my phrasing and reading that I like better, and there are certain things about Bindi's performance that I like better. I think Bindi did a great job, but yeah, it was just interesting to me that there was quite a difference. So at that community performance stage, members of the relevant community were recruited to perform each piece for recording and dissemination. You know, this was deemed the most direct way to reach stakeholders. The audiovisual impact is obviously, you know, more immediate than a written text that's a little bit deader in an internet space. So that multimodal kind of impact was the idea. Just a quick little bio of Belinda's there, since you're going to be hearing her performance, hopefully. We were invited to attend and participate in the recordings. I chose not to. I felt that, you know, that was going to be a whole different interpretation, and I just wanted the performers and researchers to get on with it themselves and not get in the way, not get in the way of that by, imposing, you know, my reading on it. Okay, so, and yes, the performer did add a few improvs and did skip a couple of moments that felt to me crucial. But like I say, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different interpretations.
Welcome to the hard sell, living life on the outside. I'm Caroline Craig, the host of this three-part series on life after prison for people with a history of injecting drug use. This series draws attention to the difficulties of daily life and the challenges people have navigating services and systems when they're newly released from prison. As you'll hear, life isn't necessarily easy on the outside. Over half the prisoner population in Australia have a history of injecting drug use, and they are more likely to return to prison over the course of their life. What follows is an artist's interpretation of people's experiences of those post-release barriers to successful reintegration into community, drawn from the real-life stories of almost 50 men and women who participated in the research that guided this series. Pieces are performed by people with lived experience of these issues. This contains potentially sensitive or distressing material and strong language, so please assess your own capacity to listen. This piece was written by Meera Atkinson and performed by Bindi Andrews. It is called Exhaustion, a poetic monologue.
I didn't have big plans for when I got out. I couldn't see the future. I just wanted to take it slow and stay off the ice, and being in that domestic violent relationship, my priority was to get him out of my house as quick as I could. I don't want to go back to jail. The day of my release, I had to go to Centrelink, and I waited 3 hours, as you do. And at the end of the day, I realised I hadn't eaten. So I went to the community health centre. But once I got there, I didn't know what to say. There was just so much swirling around my head. I didn't know what to do. Your heart's racing. It's natural adrenaline. You're on high alert. You're tense. You go from being looked after and 3 meals a day, everything done for you, and then one day you're out and on your own, and it's overwhelming. You have to make just so many decisions, and you don't know how to make them. You think there could have been someone to say, look, before you go, here's some numbers to help you sort out the basics. Coming out of prison, you have one appointment after another. It gets to you, you know. For people to change, to not go, you know, the same way they used to, they need accommodation and support and money while they get back on their feet. When he wouldn't leave, I slept rough. There were fights at the housing refuge. And it's loud, people snore and kick you. They walk over you while you're trying to sleep. And so now I avoid the rooming houses because of that drama and drugs. I know I can always say no, but when you want out, you can always say no. But when it's in front of you, it's really hard. Sometimes I feel like a failure. Sometimes I even wanted to go back, to be honest. Yeah, I did. I use eyes for reasons. You know, reasons. When I got out, them reasons, they were all still there. You feel like shit because your past is just drugs, crime, and jail. That whole cycle, no positives, nothing that makes your self-esteem go up a bit, you know? And sometimes the services don't understand just how much there is for you to manage, how much of a challenge it is to stay clean and turn your life around. I have this CCO worker, and every appointment, I don't want to go, but I suck it up because I don't want to go back to jail. Actions. And I feel sick, you know, because I know I'm going to get the rundown of just how crappy my life is. And I already know that. So draining, to be honest, being judged. Like people set out to be drug addicts. Like I'm a loser for not having it all together. One slip, they stamp you for life. I started seeing a drug and alcohol counsellor earlier on, but that did not work out. Because, to be honest, my partner wouldn't let me leave the house. I needed to find someone to unload on. Doesn't matter who it is, anyone really. They don't even have to understand. Just someone to listen. That's all. It's really just knowing someone is there. Anyway, I got away and now I'm living day by day and I'm staying away from the friends that I used to hang out with, trying to be more confident. And I want to set some goals, get a good routine going, look for work, keep busy, help me stay off the drugs because I want to get my kid back. I know I need help, but I don't know where to turn. I mean, they do try to help, but there's a different service for everything. A different person that I have to explain myself to and jump through those hoops for every single one. I just wish there was one place, one person that could help you with it all. It's hard to stop beating myself up, but I'm doing my best, trying not to worry about past too much. I'm trying to look forward, but it's not easy when you feel you can sleep for a whole week. Trying to have hope, but it's tough to turn things around because I'm just so tired. Yeah, so tired.
What we have heard is how exhausting the short-term period after release from prison is as people try to find their feet and build a life away from what sent them inside. The demands on people immediately after incarceration who have a history of drug use can feel endless. When we think about life after prison for people who inject drugs, we must think about all the conditions that services require people to meet in order to gain access to the very supports they need to get through this phase. In fact, we heard from people that these requirements may contribute to exhaustion. And so in this piece, we heard of some strategies that can maintain resilience in the face of this exhausting environment. For example, it is important to recognise that feelings of exhaustion and also feelings of being overwhelmed are both common and valid. Equally, we can see that transitional supports and post-release services should be mindful of the types of demands they are placing on exhausted and overwhelmed people and be more flexible and responsive so that they can better assist people with achieving their post-release goals. Far from seeing the individual as the issue, we need to consider the competing and often urgent, difficult decisions that are required of people released from prison as they navigate locating and securing reliable housing, accessing income, and balancing family obligations and adhering to the often lengthy requirements of their corrections orders. Manoeuvring through these post-release hurdles, often with limited supports and amid a society that may be less forgiving of their criminal history, these everyday decisions can be overwhelming. This series was produced by the Centre for Social Research in Health, University of New South Wales, in partnership with the Burnet Institute and was funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. University of New South Wales, Sydney is located on the unceded territory of the Bedegal, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which this series was recorded. If you would like more information, please go to www.arts.unsw.edu.au/CSRH.
Yeah, an important note I forgot to mention when I wasn't able to access the print version that was published in Right Now magazine is that I prefaced the piece with a really with about a paragraph of explanation of context around the study, so that readers had really specific information about this collaboration. And I also co-authored the participants. I didn't claim full authorship of the piece. I didn't feel that I could when it was based on transcripts, participant transcripts that were very much about their own experiences in their own words. So yeah, I published it as a co-authorship between me and them, although they weren't named, obviously, because I don't know who they are either in terms of individuals. Okay, so now I just want to say, before we talk about the evaluation stage of the project, that the launch was basically my piece Exhaustion was disseminated via the centre's network and on social media, and also the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association. It's basically New South Wales Drug User Advocacy Organisation. They plan to use it in collaboration with the Justice Health program called Harm Reduction in the Yard. So there's potentially yet more disseminations to come. But I think that all the pieces were disseminated, but my piece was the one that was evaluated. So we come to that point here, and Dr. Timothy Brodie is the person who gives the overview of this part of the project. Dr. Brodie has a STEM background, so he's a psychology researcher, and he conducted a study and presented in the seminar last year preliminary findings on attitudinal change that was from this study conducted, this evaluation conducted online, to ascertain whether these novel forms of research translation had the capacity to change minds. So this is obviously a really important part of the project. And we will just hear from Tim on this.
So over the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'll do a quick whirlwind tour over this intervention project we ran off the back of this creative piece that we've heard about so far. So it's going to be really, really quick. We collected a lot of data, and there's actually quite a lot of detail. This is just the high-level stuff to give a bit of an overview of what we found so far, and obviously with a bit more in-depth analysis to come as we go. So basically what we did was we used that creative piece that we've seen today as the basis for an intervention with a sample of the Australian public. So on this slide here, we've got a breakdown of the three groups that we had within the intervention study. So we had a control group and the intervention group listed there at the bottom, and then what we call the neutral control, or apparently what Karen would call boring control, just kind of as a point of comparison, presenting the research findings in a more traditional format. So we had over 2,000 participants start at baseline, and we had over 1,000 all the way through to the follow-up stage of this project, which was fantastic. To have over 350 people at that final stage across each of the groups means that we're able to see some pretty significant findings, and we're also going to be able to do some really meaningful analyses moving forward as well. So just to give a bit of an overview of people we had participate in this intervention study, average age of around 58 years, with quite a range, youngest participant 18, ranging all the way through to 90 years of age. We had a roughly 50-50 split of males and females, and very small number of non-binary or different gender identifying participants, and also vast majority, over 90%, identifying as heterosexual, and you can see just small breakdowns across other sexual identities on the slide. In terms of education, we had quite a spread. Roughly 1/3 had completed high school or lower education, another third with certificate or diploma level, and another third either undergraduate or postgraduate education as their highest qualification. Also, just wanted to point out on the right-hand side of this slide, the employment and income spread. This is where we sort of see a little bit of a skew, and just something that's important for us to keep in mind when we're looking at how people have responded. We did have quite a high proportion of retired participants, so over 40% indicated they were retired, and close to 45% with personal incomes of less than $40,000 a year. So in terms of how that represents the overall national population, we can see a little bit of a skew there. So just something to keep in mind, but yeah, it hasn't necessarily impacted the importance of the main findings we're seeing from this study. We also asked participants about their own lived experience. So when we're talking about attitudes towards people of any particular group, we know that lived experience and personal contact with people within those communities is going to be an important factor. And really what we saw was that within our sample, there was very limited lived experience of the issues that we're talking about. So around 1/4 had ever used illicit drugs in their lifetime, but then only about 5% had ever injected drugs or ever been in prison themselves. So really, the vast majority had no personal contact, no personal lived experience of being in prison or injecting drug use themselves. And we also asked about personal contact, so whether they had family members, friends, colleagues who had ever injected drugs or had ever been in prison. And again, you can see a similar trend here that overwhelmingly, 80% and higher saying that across each of these groups, no, never, and no awareness of any family member, any friend, any colleagues who had ever injected drugs or had ever been in prison. So really predominantly the sample we're talking about here are those from those segments of the broader community who don't have that contact with this particular group that we're focusing on with the intervention. So this was the procedure for the study. It was all conducted online. All participants came into the study and then were randomly allocated to one of those three groups I mentioned before, the intervention, the neutral or bland or boring control group, or the standard control group. Everyone completed baseline measures. I'll go through a couple of those over the next few slides, but essentially most of those measures were looking at various attitudes specifically targeted towards people who had recently been released from prison and had a history of injecting drug use. So we're looking at both of those factors at the same time, rather than trying to differentiate between injecting drug use and history of incarceration. We were trying to get people to think about that group of people who experienced both of those issues simultaneously. Following the baseline measures, people from the intervention group watched that video that we all watched earlier on today. And those in the neutral group watched a standard presentation of results. So that's the typical way research findings would normally be presented around emerging themes, what we did, this is what we found, and so on. Those two groups then completed the same measures again to see if there had been any change immediately after watching the video. The control group got a bit of an easy ride. They didn't have to do the second lot of measures. And then at 3 months, we followed everyone up to see what the changes had been over that time. Just to give you an indication of what attitudes kind of look like at baseline, we asked all participants whether they were behaving negatively towards other people because of injecting drug use or because of their incarceration in prison. And you can see here there's quite a spread, but actually quite high levels of people saying that to some extent, yes, I would behave negatively towards somebody else because they inject drugs or because they've been in prison. 78% for injecting drug use and 71% for incarceration. So really we are seeing a group where there's some level of negative attitude quite prominent across the sample. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show how various attitudes changed over the 3 separate time points. The first one, we're looking at a measure of stigmatizing attitudes. So higher scores represent more stigmatizing, more negative attitudes. What we really want to see is a reduction in stigma. And that's what we're seeing here with this attitudes measure. As would be expected, you can see with the yellow line, the control group from baseline through to follow-up showed no change. They had no intervention, so that's what we would expect to see. For both the bland control and the intervention group in the red and the green, from baseline to post-intervention, we saw a significant reduction in their stigmatizing attitudes straight after watching the video. And that effect was noticeably stronger with the intervention group as opposed to the bland control. By the time we got to follow-up, you can see that things have started to bounce back. The bland control have gone back to a level where there's no significant difference from their baseline levels. The intervention group is still slightly lower than baseline, so we're still seeing some residual effect, but you can see that it is heading back towards those baseline levels. We had a measure of distance, which is basically the idea of, I want to keep my distance from these people. I wouldn't go to a shop if someone from this community was working there. I don't want to work with this group of people. And again, we're seeing the same pattern here. So that desire for distance reduced for both of those the plan control and the intervention group. Again, the intervention showing a more significant shift, but then both of those reverting back to baseline levels after 3 months. Similar picture here in terms of empathy, except it's flipped around because empathy is a good thing. And what we want to see is that empathy towards this group is going to increase. And again, yeah, that is what we saw. Control group stayed stable from baseline through to follow-up. And for both of the other groups, an increase in empathy straight after watching the video before reverting back to baseline at follow-up. I also just want to really quickly skim over some idea of scenarios that we included in the survey. So we presented people with hypothetical scenarios and asked them how much they agreed or disagreed with the behaviour that was depicted in there. So this is just one example. We had a few of them throughout the survey. And basically, we're talking about someone who's been recently released from prison, required to attend drug testing appointments. But then when they fail to attend one without notice, they get told, off you go and find another service, we're not going to help you anymore. And ask people, how much do you agree or disagree with this decision, to tell them that they need to find an alternative service. And basically what we see here is reflective of what we saw on the previous slides, that straight after the intervention, yes, there's a slight shift in a positive direction, but the narrative video, that effect is a little bit stronger. Whereas in the neutral control, really what we saw is more that people who were sort of mid-range, neutral, unsure, they started to say, okay, yeah, that's probably not okay, and then revert back. Whereas in the narrative video, some of the people who agreed with it at baseline started to have a bit of a shift. Think, oh, maybe that's not so okay. But again, for both of them by follow-up, we're reverting back to baseline levels. So that same pattern happening across a range of different measures. A quick summary, while we still have a little bit of time left for questions afterwards, really what we're essentially seeing from this intervention is some immediate positive changes after watching each of the videos, whether it was the narrative version or whether it was that bland control. But the changes in the group who saw the narrative version were noticeably larger compared to the neutral version. For both of those, there was that tendency to revert back to baseline levels after 3 months. So early stages in terms of our analysis and what we're going to be able to pull out of all of this, but essentially the emerging findings are that this kind of narrative intervention really does have the potential to influence public opinions, but it's not just a one-stop shop. The messaging really does need to be reinforced over time to ensure that people can take hold of that message and keep it front of mind in order to have a meaningful and long-term change.
That really, confirms my own research around the capacity for creative writing to affect social change and perception change. And I'm giving the last word here to James Baldwin. I can't reference it because I just grabbed it off Goodreads. I'm not quite sure what text that comes from, but he says, you write in order to change the world, knowing perfectly well that you probably can't, but also knowing that literature is indispensable to the world. The world changes according to the way people see it. And if you alter even but a millimetre the way people look at reality, then you can change it. So I think obviously the big message here is that, it can and does make a difference. Literature has done so throughout the ages, but it's not a quick fix, obviously. If we're wanting to see, research having a real impact in terms of change, and we're wanting to use creative writing strategies to enhance that, then the plan is going to have to be that we need a kind of staged rollout, but there needs to be some sort of reinforcing. And I think that makes sense. If you think about how entrenched and how conditioned a lot of attitudes are that social researchers might be wanting to challenge and change, it makes sense that it's not going to be one exposure that really makes a difference. It's going to be a chipping away. So I think that pretty much concludes my my presentation, and I think we're kind of bang on time for Michael to take over.
Thanks, Meera. Thanks so much for that. Such a thoughtful and engaging kind of presentation, and also raises so many questions. I think I'm kind of fascinated by this work. I've got kind of 1,000 questions, but I'll hand it over to people who are on the chat who have some questions. I might start with, I think I might mispronounce this, but I'll try. Ali, do you want to unmute and ask your question and fix my pronunciation, please?
Yes. No, you're very close, Ali.
Ali. Okay. Do you want to ask your question to Meera?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Meera. That was such an interesting discussion, and I really loved how you'd converted that, what would have been a mixture of interview transcripts and polyvocal narratives and kind of turned it into one coherent narrative. Yeah, super powerful and very interesting to hear the whole process. I suppose I'm interested because at the moment I'm very interested in getting involved in this kind of thing and using creative techniques to communicate research, like for instance with long form creative nonfiction, but also more rigorous academic research. But I've recently been working on a literature review that looks at how creative writing contributes to well-being for marginalized youth. And one of the things that has been coming out is that those kinds of workshops and programs can be really crucial to developing their own sense of agency and voice, and being able to control the narratives that are being circulated about themselves and people who have had similar experiences to them. And so I wonder, I suppose I'm curious to know, what do you think is the value of doing this kind of work in interpreting, I suppose, a range of interviews with people who've had a certain experience as a professional creative writer, as opposed to putting effort into facilitating people to tell their own stories?
I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you very much for that. I mean, look, I loved working on this project, and I really enjoyed being able to craft something out of the transcripts. But I think what you're gesturing towards is really important, and actually is kind of a next step. I think that would be fabulous, is to really explore the potential of somebody like me, perhaps, people from a creative writing team in a university context to work with participants directly. I guess the problem there, and I mean, I think Karen's here. Karen might want to pipe up and speak to this if available. But I think this would open up a whole range of very tricky challenges ethically, managerially, because if we're working dynamically, say in a workshop setting, like I'm thinking in response to that question, the first thing that came up was when I was doing my PhD at Western Sydney in the Writing and Society Research Centre, I volunteered once. There was a program that people from the creative from the centre would facilitate creative writing workshops with high school students in Western Sydney region. So I facilitated a poetry workshop with a couple of classes out in the western suburbs, and it was fantastic, and just the excitement of that sort of discovery of voice and agency through writing was really thrilling. But that's obviously a much less complex scenario than a cohort of research study participants like this. So I'm not quite sure how that would work if we were, but I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think it's definitely worth thinking through. Karen, do you have any thoughts off the top of your head? Do you want to weigh in on that? Like, I'd love to be part of a creative writing team that worked, for example, with this cohort to produce their own pieces. But I think it would pose a lot of tricky questions for the social researchers involved. Are you there, Karen?
Yeah, sorry, I'm in my pajamas, sorry.
Put you on the spot.
Look, I guess the main thing here is that one of the briefs that we said when we were recruiting writers was that they needed to have some kind of proximate lived experience to these issues, and that could be defined by the writers themselves. So it was a self-selection. So in some cases, we wanted to make sure that there were people who had a particular sensitivity to these issues that we felt would be equipped to handle the data. And ethically, this is a quagmire. Like, it took ages to get ethics through for this. And the main thing is that we have to protect the anonymity of the research participants themselves. We have to protect the safety and well-being of people involved in the project. The reason why we had mentors assigned, I think that Meera, given her expertise in traumatic material, was well positioned to take on this work. But the reason we paid Red Room essentially was to be there as a support in case people became distressed from the information. And the other thing is that I think our primary aim here was to do research dissemination. There are amazing projects out there that look at storytelling as capacity building for people with marginalised experience. And in fact, we're actually currently evaluating a program that NIDA and LHA are putting together that's looking at LGBTQ people with a disability, and they're producing these storytelling workshops to allow people to then produce their own digital story as a form of advocacy, and we're asked to evaluate that. So, I live in the research world. I don't have a creative bone in my body. So, I don't have the capacity to mentor someone through this process. We really felt we needed to engage with professionals in this instance. And the actual mentorship and the capacity building that was built around the performers, who are the ones that we had definite direct lived experience of these issues. I mean, that short diagram of all of the steps involved, misses a whole range of capacity building and mentorship. And, it took 6 months of my life getting this up and running. Thanks for the invitation to clarify, Meera.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, it is a wonderful potential, but I can see issues with it. And I think it would, I think this project already did so much. For example, it was doing lots of different arms of labour, and I think that would have been very difficult. Plus, there is the, putting my kind of, trauma researcher hat on here for a minute. I think there is something different about, participants in a study like this talking to a researcher and doing an interview in a fairly sort of safe, controlled environment, and the risk level that happens when participants are perhaps all in a room, exposed to each other's kind of traumatic histories as well. It would very much depend, on their level of ability to process and cope with that. It could become very overwhelming. So I can see lots of issues, but it's a great question and a really interesting idea.
Thanks very much.
Emma, I'm just wondering if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Hello.
Hi, Emma.
Thanks so much, Meera. It was so wonderful hearing you share. I'm really fascinated by all of this. And yeah, my question is like I'm studying both creative writing and criminology simultaneously. So everything you are sharing is right down my alley. And so my main question centered around suggestions on how you could get involved in projects like this in the future, what the process of recruitment is, are there steps that I could be, well, sorry, I have a dog, this is why I'm muted. What kind of things can you do to actually head down this similar road?
Yeah, look, another good question, but I don't think I have a very satisfying answer for you, because I think I'm not aware of many researchers using this strategy in Australia. I was really excited when Karen approached me, and I was like, yeah, I'm in. So I don't know how much it's been done. As I said initially, that this is one of my reasons for doing this, because I'm really hoping to sort of stimulate some more interest at UCED and beyond in this. I'd love to be involved in more of it too. And I'm not sure how many opportunities there are, but I really do think it's kind of a way of the future thing. I think it is something we're going to start seeing more and more of. And I think, we were talking, there was a talk recently in Bass, and it was about Aboriginal and research, Indigenous research, but it was, and the speaker was talking about how it's just standard in when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers that they work in creative dissemination ways. It's completely natural to them. It's the way that they have the reach, and their projects are very community driven. So they're not investigating questions that the academics sit around in a room going, oh, this would be really interesting. They're going to community and saying what matters to you, and then they're going off and doing studies, and then they're disseminating creatively. So I think that it's a kind of, I think that this is a First Nations kind of led practice space, and I really hope that that people more broadly start taking it up. Well, good luck with it, and I hope that you get some opportunities to do that. It does sound like you're a great fit for it.
Thanks. That's great.
And Emma, Keren's put some good suggestions in the chat that might be worth following up.
Perfect.
The other thing for everyone, there's actually and it's not exactly the same as this, but there's a conference a free conference run by Michael Balfour at University of New South Wales, featuring Geese Theatre, which works with incarcerated people in the UK. I've dropped a link to that in the chat if anyone's interested in taking part in that. But that's another kind of place where, arts and incarceration are kind of at an intersectional interacting at least. And do you want to unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks for this. Really interesting. I work in family violence, and I also worked for a while in science communications, and it strikes me that there's some similar drivers happening here. Science communications is all about figuring out how to, convey complex issues in a way that capture people's imagination, correct? And I'm hearing that that's what you're looking at here with this project, and yet it's regarding social research findings. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I was trained in sociology as an undergrad, and I did a lot of interview studies, and the qualitative part of the research was obviously the most fascinating part for me. And how I relayed that research in whatever I wrote would be the difference between getting a C and an A+, frankly. Like, how did I convey what these interviewees were sharing with me? And the more I could capture what they said with their permission in a way that it was engaging, I said it made a difference. And I'm not saying that the idea here is to get good grades, but it is about capturing the larger public audience. Am I understanding correctly?
I think so. Yeah.
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 And yeah. I mean, science communications has become this entire industry, right? And I think it's great that there's people looking at ways to communicate social research in a way that can capture public attention, because it needs to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about science communication sort of formally, because I don't live in the science realm. But I did co-author an article with Jen Webb and Jordan Williams, which was published, I think it was last year, in text, called Literary Bridges. And it was about how creative work, creative writing and literature can and does work as a kind of a mode of communication for all kinds of different scientific contexts, portals, avenues, let's say. I talked a bit about my book Traumata in that article, because I could speak to process by talking about, because that's very much a hybrid sort of memoir, research hybrid, and it is doing a lot of work about communicating around trauma on a lot of different levels, including neuroscience. So yeah, I think it's something that isn't acknowledged enough, and that's the point of why we wanted to publish that article, because it's there, it happens, it's not necessarily new. I think literature has always been this marriage in a sense of literature and science, but it's like we've kind of fallen into this trap of thinking that they're, completely opposite and can never be reconciled. They're just two modes and of course that's for good reason. There's a lot of huge differences in the way, scientific and creative methodologies work and contexts, but there is a relationship there, is the point we wanted to make.
Right, exactly. And I just immediately think of all the stories that I hear every day as a domestic violence worker, and the degree to which those stories are never heard to the broader public. So what you were presenting today about from the research, what people were saying, and particularly that piece that was spoken from your, from what you did with hard cell exhaustion.
Yeah.
I mean, the cadence, her cadence of her presentation, and I mean, just everything. I mean, immediately you were drawn in. You could feel it. I could feel myself leaning forward. I was getting right into it. And there's so much out there that would.
It's a great point. It's a great point, Anne. And I think, maybe that's something, because, there's so much discussion of, what can we do? Why, women are killed every year. People, this is just every week, this is, the statistics are overwhelming, and yet nothing changes. And there's, lots of people doing really good work on a lot of fronts, obviously, but somehow it's not, it's not getting through enough. And maybe more of these creative strategies would, I don't know, what's the potential? Would it encourage more people who have histories of violence to get help? Would it make a difference? Would it somehow, and would it at least give voice to the women who and the people who are, who are victimized by violence? Because it's so often the case that they're erased in media coverage, let's say.
Yeah,
we see that all the time, right?
Well, I'm not to belabor this, but I mean, Rosa Parks, for instance, wasn't the first woman to go onto the bus and look for a different, and ask, and to sit in the white section, right? There were 3 others before her, but they didn't fit the profile that was sympathetic to the larger white community. And when Rosa went on and it got picked up, that changed public opinion forever, right? And I'm not saying that you orchestrate all of this, but I'm just saying that how you present the information can make a huge difference.
Well, and that's
really remarkable.
It's one of the great pleasures of being a writer, that you get to, that there's you shape a narrative. You can shape, you curate experience when you write. I do also want to just quickly acknowledge my language there probably suggested that I was assuming that victims of violence are always women and perpetrators are always men, but we do know that there's a fairly significant percentage pattern there. So, but I just want to acknowledge it's not always, and it's not always a gender binary. Are we up? How are we going for time?
Got about a minute left. Terry just made a great comment about different arts forms engaging in different ways, which also reminded me of we just had a conference on research-based theatre at the University of Sydney, and some of the some of the outcomes of that will be available through Create on our YouTube channel, as will this presentation as well. But I think, seeing we're close to time, Meera, do you have any final comments you wanted to leave our participants with?
Look, I'm just catching up with Terry's comment in chat, and I think, yeah, I agree. It's a great comment and a great point that there are, there's scope for a lot of different kinds of strategies, and I think it's, I think it's just about looking at what suits the objectives and aims, of the community involved, of the researchers involved. And yeah, but what I'm really hoping to see is that, there's more. I'd love to have people in FAS who, and at other universities as well, who do research that lends itself to creative interpretation. I'd love to hear from more of those people. I'd certainly be up for it. I'm sure some of my colleagues in creative writing might be up for it. And, depending on what kind of form of creative work that you are interested in. Emma's up for it. We're here, we're out there. So waiting to hear from people who do research that might lend itself to this and might benefit from creative interpretation impact, let's say.
Well, I think, Meera, kind of picking up on that, and from Create's perspective, there's certainly a lot of interest and connections, I think, with people who are working in this way. So mostly the work that we've done so far has been in drama and theatre, but there's no reason why creative writing, music and other forms of expression couldn't be included in that. I'm sure there's people at the conservatorium and beyond the university actually who'd be really interested in that. So maybe there's a symposium down the track in something like this. I think we'd be really...
That's a great idea. That's a really great idea. I just want to amplify Karen's comment in chat that everyone involved in this, including the advisory committee, performers, writers, etc., were all paid. And, that is the beauty of having a funded project, obviously. That means that people can be compensated for their time and energy in the project. So thanks for that point, Karen.
Excellent. All right, so thanks so much, Meera, and everyone for joining us this evening. I think this is probably the start of a conversation rather than the end, so I'm really looking forward to what might ensue, and please be in touch if you've got ideas for taking all this a bit further, and, we're really open to that. But for now, thanks very much for joining us, and see you all next time.